Hello, this is Mr. Gonzalez, and this is the fourth installment in my five-part lesson on the United States and its role in World War II. I want to begin this installment by taking a quick look at the opposing sides. When we discuss World War II, we usually refer to the two sides as the Allies and the Axis. As far as the Allies go, now that the United States has officially joined the war, they include the United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union. And those three nations are usually referred to as the Big Three. France is sometimes included in that, but it's important to remember that France as a nation had been overrun by the Germans at this point in time. And when we talk about the French war effort, we're usually referring to the French resistance led by General Charles de Gaulle. As far as leaders go, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, of course, is still the President of the United States. As far as military leaders go, Dwight D. Eisenhower is placed in charge of all American operations in Europe, while the two American commanders in the Pacific Theater are Douglas MacArthur and Chester Nimitz. When we talk about the European theater and the Pacific Theater, we are referring to the war efforts against Germany, that being Europe, and Japan, that being the Pacific. Great Britain, the political leader of Great Britain at this point in time is Winston Churchill, who is the Prime Minister, and really the only British military commander that you might need to know is Bernard Montgomery, who is a British general. And of course, the Soviet Union is led by the Soviet Premier, Joseph Stalin. As far as the Axis goes, the three main Axis powers are going to be Germany, Italy, and Japan. Germany, of course, is led by Adolf Hitler, and one of his main military leaders is going to be Field Marshal Erwin Rommel. He participated in the German invasion of France, and we will be discussing him a little bit more later. In Italy, really just need to know the leader, Benito Mussolini. And in Japan, the Emperor of Japan is Emperor Hirohito, and the Prime Minister is Hideki Tojo. I mentioned him in the first installment. He was a very militant man, supporter of a Japanese militarism. And let's go ahead and move on. And let's take a look at the early efforts in Europe. When the U.S. first entered the war, President Roosevelt adopted a Europe first policy where we would focus primarily on defeating Hitler and Nazi Germany before turning our attention on Japan. That is not to say that we left Japan completely alone to do whatever they wanted in the Pacific while we focused on Hitler. But our primary focus after joining the war was defeating Hitler. So the first American efforts in the European theater were in North Africa. Italian forces had invaded North Africa in 1941 and had done fairly badly. So Hitler had dispatched German forces there under the command of Field Marshal Erwin Rommel. And since February or so of 1941, German forces, the German Afrika Korps under Erwin Rommel, and British forces under Bernard Montgomery had been pushing each other back and forth across the North African desert. In November of 1942, American troops commanded by Dwight Eisenhower finally arrived in North Africa, and the two Allied armies were able to essentially squeeze Rommel's force between them. And in May of 1943, the German Afrika Korps surrendered. Once German forces had been forced out of North Africa, Great Britain and the United States turned their attention on an invasion of Sicily and Italy. If you've ever looked at a map of the Mediterranean Sea, you'll notice Italy looks like the boot and Sicily is the football that it's kicking. So in 1943, American and British forces launch a joint invasion, first of Sicily and then of Italy. And they slowly make their way up the Italian boot, and eventually the dictatorship of Benito Mussolini is actually overthrown, and he is imprisoned by his own people. He's eventually broken out by German commandos, but toward the end of the war, he's recaptured by Italian rebels and he is executed. And his body is hung in the street, and it's not a very pretty end for Benito Mussolini. Around the same time period, the three primary Allied leaders, FDR, Churchill, and Stalin, are trying to formulate a definitive war aim. What are our war goals? In January of 1943, FDR and Winston Churchill meet in Casablanca, Morocco, and they adopt a policy of unconditional surrender. They are not going to negotiate with Hitler. They're not going to negotiate with the Japanese. They will not accept any kind of terms except unconditional surrender. Their troops lay down their arms and surrender completely. Later that same year, the big three all meet together for the first time in Tehran, which is the capital of Iran. And Stalin essentially is feeling the pressure. His armies have been pushing back the German invasion of the Soviet Union on their own for the past 2 years. And the number of Russian soldiers who have been killed or wounded is in the millions at this point in time. And he wants some of that pressure taken off of his troops. So essentially, they strike a deal. Roosevelt and Churchill promise that they will invade France, which at this point in time is under Nazi control, and open a second front. You should remember from World War I, Germany was in a fairly bad position when World War I broke out because they had to fight a war on two fronts. They had to fight France to the west and Russia to the east. And Stalin essentially wants to create that same situation. He wants British and American troops in France moving toward Germany from the west while his own troops are pushing the Germans back from the east. So FDR and Churchill promise that they will start planning an invasion of France, and in return, Stalin will attack Japan and help with the defeat of Japan once Germany has been defeated. On June 6th, 1944. Great Britain and the United States hold up their end of the deal and they launch an invasion of France. Now, the official name of this operation is Operation Overlord, but it's gone down in history as the D-Day invasion or the D-Day landings. The invasion takes place along the coast of Normandy, France. 5 beaches are stormed, and the Allied forces manage to hold on to their beachheads. Once they've established a foothold, they start moving inland, and they start to liberate the rest of Europe. By the end of August, they have liberated Paris. So slowly, the American forces are taking Europe back from Hitler. Hitler makes his last attempt to stop the American and British advance from the West at what is called the Battle of the Bulge. This is in December of 1944. Winter had really set in by this point in time, and the American and British armies had left their lines relatively thin. So Hitler made a last-ditch effort to push back the German and American troops. He did manage to surround portions of the American army, most famously around the town of Bastogne. But eventually the Allies did dig in and were able to push the Germans back. By the end of April of 1945, the Russians had reached the outskirts of Berlin, which is the capital of Germany. It became very obvious that the war was over, and rather than be captured, Hitler committed suicide. And a week later, Germany surrendered to the Allies. This is more or less the situation that Hitler found himself in. Here is Berlin. That is where Hitler was. By the time the war ended, he was hiding in a bunker. And he had the Russians pushing in to Germany from the east. He had the British and the Americans coming in from the west. And he was simply squeezed in between the two armies. All right, as far as the aftermath of the war in Europe goes, one is the Holocaust. I've talked about Hitler's racial beliefs, how he believed that any undesirable persons had to be removed from the German population. Well, he manages to get the number of Jews in Germany from about 800,000 to about 200,000. But when he invaded Poland, well, there's a couple million Jews that live in Poland. And when he invaded the Soviet Union, well, there's around 8 million Jews that live in the Soviet Union. So he has to deal with this question. I just picked up 10 or 12 million more Jews. What do I do with them? Well, he decided that he would exterminate them. He starts moving them to concentration camps where they are either exterminated using gas chambers, or they are worked essentially to death. And all in all, around 6 million Jews are killed in the Holocaust. The total number of deaths from the Holocaust is usually numbered around 11 million, because remember, it wasn't just Jews that were targeted. You had gypsies, homosexuals, Jehovah's Witnesses, and so on and so forth. And then the Yalta Conference. This was a meeting that took place in the Soviet Union at the very end of World War II in Europe, where they agreed that Germany would be divided between the U.S., Great Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. They agreed that Poland would be able to hold free elections. The Soviet Union had set up a communist government there as they pushed the Germans back. Stalin once again promised to attack Japan, and they agreed to create the United Nations, which was a replacement for the League of Nations.